I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what it takes to win these really huge contests in terms of, roster construction and the types of players that you need. It's very rarely the team that wins these contests that kind of just nails all the upside players and is just an unstoppable team.
When to take risks in fantasy football, and would you risk it all to become a fantasy football millionaire? That's what we're going to talk about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Leone of Establish the Run, the Director of Analytics over there. And I think he's going to be a great person to have this conversation with. So it was a listener submitted idea, but we're going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to do the host duties and say, Mike, welcome on to the podcast. I hope you're getting pretty excited here, because I did see we're recording this Monday, the 14th of July. I believe just 8 Sundays left to NFL Week 1. So time is ticking by here. I'm getting, what I'm actually feeling now is with a 10-month-old child in the house, I'm not able to hit the drafts as often as I would have in previous years. And I'm starting to get that kind of like, we better get cranking here.
Yeah, no, I feel you. Congrats on dad life. But yeah, I'm getting ready for the season. I'm pumped for it. I enjoy the off season because it's, a lot of fun talking best ball and stuff, but there's something about the grind of the season, just knowing kind of like what I'm doing each week and the routine, even though it's busy, that I prefer actually a little bit, even though it's actually busier than the off season.
I enjoy the off season where you can have the time to speculate on the rookies. Then you have the draft. You can kind of have your thoughts and even have those thoughts grow as the off season goes on. When it gets to week 1, it's kind of like instant change of thoughts, what to keep and what to throw away from a weekly basis. But the season is coming quick, but yeah, I need to get into those draft rooms a lot more frequently. So getting into the topic that we're going to talk about today, it was sent in on a Twitter question from Cooper DeYoung, and he was talking about, we know to kind of look at those small hit, big miss players, in terms of when you're on the draft board, who maybe feels like a safe player. They're not going to like truly crush ADP, but they're also probably not going to sink you. But what about those players who are potentially big miss, but big hit? So like a player who were maybe thinking the range of outcomes is much bigger, that they could be the wide receiver 1, but they could be the wide receiver 25, and we're drafting them in the second or third round. He did mention a couple of names. He mentioned Tyreek Hill, Rashee Rice, Marvin Harrison, Breece Hall. I really feel like out of that list, the one that strikes the one for me, and I've been fading him so far, would be like a Marvin Harrison, where you're drafting him in the kind of the 3rd round range or the 4th round range potentially even. And if he has a bounce back and like kind of hits that sophomore ceiling that he could have and becomes the wide receiver 1 in the offense, he has the range of outcomes to be an absolute crushing player this year. But he also feels like a player who, even at his floor, you're like, well, this is just not getting it done in the 4th round. How are you feeling about how we should approach we could also talk about that kind of the safe play, but we'll go first for the big miss, big hit players.
There's a lot of nuance to this. The first thing is sometimes we're not even good at like knowing what the bet is in terms of it being a big hit, big miss player. Like you look at someone like Tyreek, if he stays, Tyreek Hill was kind of like an example, but if he stays healthy all season long, the floor there actually might be pretty good, even if he takes a decline, just because the target share is going to be so concentrated. And the offense historically, at least when Tua's been healthy, is so efficient. I know people are probably saying the big miss is like Tyreek, falls off the age cliff or Tua gets hurt again. But sometimes we overweight those risks on a team just because it just happened, a couple of times. They've gotten bad luck the past few years. And I don't know if he's necessarily as big hit, big miss of a player as maybe it seems to be. So that's the first thing, is like trying to kind of just recalibrate like our expectations for players and just understand.
I feel on him, unless he gets hurt, like there's a floor there that's really almost impossible to go below, like a 5th round value. Like even if like the season tanks, it's hard to see him going below that, but he has the ceiling. But out of that list, you might think that Rice fits. I think Rice has like a relatively like a safe lower floor, but also a massive spike potential. That, as I said, the Marvin Harrison's the one that really would strike me in this kind of particular range.
Yeah, and Harrison's one, talking micro here about Harrison specifically. I'm like you, I haven't drafted a ton of him. Um, I thought going into the offseason he would be a player that I would get a lot. But the discount on him from last year isn't as steep as I wanted it to be or expected it to be. It's hard to sort of throw out, kind of a disappointing rookie season. Not a whole lot has changed there in terms of, the personnel and the coaching. So I definitely have some concerns over Harrison, and I wonder if the truly big hit season is there, with Trey McBride kind of being the alpha for Arizona. So that's where I wonder. And again, that goes back to like the nuance of like, are we even great at figuring out if it's a big hit, big miss player? I would argue on like the Tyreek side that he might not be as big of a miss player as it seems. And then on the Marvin Harrison side, he might not be as big of a hit player as it seems. So a lot of it's case by case basis. The other point I wanted to make that's a little bit broader, if we're talking best ball, please excuse my cat in the background. He decides to, jump into these videos. But if we're talking, best ball contests where you're really trying to hit it big. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what it takes to win these really huge contests in terms of, roster construction and the types of players that you need. It's very rarely the team that wins these contests that kind of just nails all the upside players and is just an unstoppable team. That might be the case if you're playing one of these contests where it's cumulative score weeks 1 through 17. But the biggest contests on DraftKings and Underdog are kind of 4 stages. You have the regular season, and then you've got 3 non-continuous playoff stages that you have to get through. So keeping that in mind, there's just so much variance that you have to wrap your head around. And the other side to that too is people think of best ball as like, oh, I can take cracks on huge upside because of the best ball scoring. When in reality, sometimes just not being so fragile with a roster actually leads to upside. Like these safe rosters can lead to a lot of upside because you're never taking zeros. You always have a usable score to fill in. So it's a really interesting conversation, but I definitely feel like that's one of the kind of misnomers about best ball is that you can take all these really big hit, big miss shots because it doesn't matter because it's best ball scoring. That's not necessarily the best way to construct your roster.
I think maybe a good way to continue the conversation is to kind of go into some of that and then circle back to, I guess, the way that we would select some of these players maybe towards the end then for these contests. But when you're looking at trying to avoid those zeros in your lineup, how much of an emphasis should fantasy players, particularly in these bigger field best ball tournaments, be putting into that particular aspect of, particularly, like, are you putting a reference on that to more so in the first 10 rounds or in the entire draft, or how should people be playing that?
I think what you want, not necessarily break it down to first 10 or the last 10 drafts, but you want a mix of archetypes in your lineup. So let's say you think the rookie wide receivers, there's a real opportunity there to hit on some of this big time upside. If you go into a season and you've got 5 rookie receivers out of your 7 wide receiver spots, you might be too fragile. We know these types of players have the ability to pay off their price tag, but these kind of are like bigger hit, bigger miss players where they might not have an established role out of the gate. You might fall behind, not even advance in the first place. Or a lot of these guys, they will miss. We don't take them because they're safe picks. We take them because when they do hit, they have the ability to beat their ADP by so much. So that's where I might want to mix in some rookies with some of the boring, veteran guys. A player that I like a lot at value later in drafts is Romeo Doubs for Green Bay. And he sort of fits into those rosters where you've got maybe take some upside swings on some younger players with more playing time uncertainty. And then you get a guy that he's just going to be out there and running a ton of routes. He might not be a world breaker. He might not have this huge ceiling, but he's going to be out there running a ton of routes, with solid quarterback play. And those are the types of picks that actually end up as part of a portfolio like better in best ball, I think, than in redraft. In redraft, we kind of just care about the upside, right? Like if a player doesn't hit, that's fine. We pick somebody else off the waiver wire, start them. We don't need to have this safe guy on the bench to slot in because we have the waiver wire at our disposal. And we want players that it just becomes so obvious that they're starts that we're obviously starting them each week. In best ball, we do kind of want some of those safer players that are going to be running a lot of routes, going to see a bit more assured volume in order to make sure that when we start 3 wide receivers in a flex, and there's going to be injuries and guys bust on a certain week, we don't want to take some really low scores on a week. Like that will kill you.
And I think a good conversation to go to is, you mentioned the rookie wide receivers in particular, and we can add rookie running backs to that and potentially even rookie tight ends. But some of the lineups that I'll draft, I think, can be, like, self-admitting, be almost too aggressive towards rookies at certain points. And like, you're looking at those particular early points of seasons, and if it doesn't click in those first, like, say, 4 or 5 weeks, you're already so far behind that it's going to be hard for that team to get itself back into play to make it to the playoffs. Fair enough, the team may be very strong in the playoffs, but if you're not in, it doesn't really matter. So I'm putting my hands up as somebody who's going to aggressively draft those rookies. When you're looking at balancing out, like there you mentioned Dobbs, are you looking at those kind of names in the back part of drafts, or are you looking at them in the front half? So let's say another name that could, like, if we're looking early rounds, we mentioned Tyreek Hill, but like a Devontae Adams would kind of fit into that. There is some veterans that aren't as exciting, maybe, and I'm saying not for me, aren't as, but will have strong profiles. Like if you look at the Dobbs play that you mentioned, like if you're looking at a more elite version of that historically has been Devontae Adams, and like if we're looking at like red zone threats, both of them kind of fit into that. So are you looking though to balance that, just if you have a draft where you've gone rookies early to try and balance it, or are you looking to get the upside in the rookies and then balance it out with those veterans? Another name that I don't know if he's one you like, but like in later in drafts, an Adam Thielen seems to kind of fit that Romeo Dobbs style as well. Yeah,
definitely. I wouldn't say I'm going into a draft with a specific plan. I'm saying like I'm going to take rookies early and then fill in with these vets late. I like to really kind of be a value hound early. A lot of the research we've done at ETR has shown, like, if you're taking really strong ADP values and then just smart about your roster construction from there, like that's one of the best ways to beat these games. It's a little bit more boring than just having like hot player takes and like really strong percentages. And there's certainly room to be overweight and underweight players, even meaningfully so within that. But as a result, a lot of times I'm starting with the values and then kind of deciding from there. So there's times it'll work the other way where I'll end up just with like fat wide receivers early as the best values. And then that's when I might reach, I say reach, but I might move up my board more than I normally, like a Jaden Higgins or Noel from Houston, or I might just really try to ensure that I have that type of profile in my room, because
but you have a combination of the veteran and the youth on the same roster, like rather than a planned strategy going in, it's as a draft of it. And that's kind of what I was trying to lean to, like, and it kind of builds in as the draft goes along.
Yeah, and so you can start it out honestly either way. And the one thing I'll note, like some of the rookies, like Tre'Torian McMillan, I don't know if I'd even slot him into this conversation because he's going to play right away and like get a ton of volume, right? Like we're not really worried. So I don't think I'm like, if I see him on my roster, I'm not like overly concerned about my room. It's more, it does tend to be, I guess, maybe some of the rookies later, or you can consider the injured players,
and
guys that might
that,
start out slow, like Rashee Rice or Chris Godwin. Like those are types too that you might want to consider, like, hey, I might want to patch some early production here.
And that conversation as well, when we've kind of framed it as the rookies veterans thing, more so as well, I guess, to fit into this conversation of potential big miss, low floor kind of players. If we're looking at some of the kind of players that are in between, there's like a range of drafts. You mentioned Chris Godwin, but you have the Jalen Waddle pick in there. You've Travis Hunter, Roma Dunze, Jerry Jeudy, Calvin Ridley, Chris Olave, Jordan Addison, Joanne Jennings. There's a lot of players in that. If we're looking at like the FFPC rounds, kind of 7 through 9, there's a lot of like players who have moved teams, like a Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs are in there, Matthew Golden being a rookie. There's so many players in that zone. Deebo Samuel, another player who moved teams. But how are you feeling like about those kind of names if you're building out a roster? They kind of fit to me as like, I think if you polled the fantasy football community, they'll have 3 names in those 3 rounds. So they're like, oh, that's my guy this year. And then if like you go and ask me or you on the same player, we could be like, that player's not on my board. And the players that we like I think people are either in or out on a lot of those names. So I think there's the wide range of outcomes there make them fit into potential kind of big hit and low floor plays where like their value could be 0 after week 6, but they also could be like the focal part of their offense.
Yeah, I generally am in on the types of players that, they've switched teams and like there's some sort of uncertainty there. And the market generally treats these players more disfavorably than favorably. I mean, we saw it last year with all the running backs that switched teams and went to good offenses. And I was guilty of not maybe seeing the full optimistic range of outcomes on some of these players, but we had like Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, Derrick Henry. Like we had a whole slew, Saquon Barkley, a whole slew of players that were super important in fantasy. And like the main thing they had in common was they were backs with pedigree who went to different teams in solid offenses. And, we had maybe as a market, like didn't consider the upside component to that. And we're just maybe too focused on like the micro analysis of the running backs and being scared of that position. Obviously, we're talking about receivers here, but I definitely think you can throw in like Debo into the mix. I think you can throw, Stephon Diggs is someone that we're pretty high on, and there's definitely risks there, right? Like he's an older player. There's concerns over his talent level. There's, if it's dropping off or not. There's concerns over returning from injury combined with the age. But you also see the upside, which is like he has absolutely no target competition and he's got a young ascending quarterback to play with. So I would definitely consider these guys, like you said, in the vein of rookies, sophomores in your portfolio. The key thing that's holding all these players together is just uncertainty, right? Like we don't know how to price these players. We know how to price, Jacoby Myers, Jerry Jeudy. Like we have a pretty good idea of how to price those players. That doesn't make them not valuable. Again, they can be very valuable in the right room, but it's unlikely we're going to see them massively pay off their ADP. Those are kind of your small hit players that you want some of them because a little bit assured, but it doesn't come with the same uncertainty of some of these other players. And again, when it comes to constructing the room too, the other consideration is based on how you start. It's not only if you've started with vets or rookies or vice versa, it's how many wide receivers are you going to end up drafting altogether. It can kind of help lean towards the way that you should go. So if I'm drafting running back heavy early and I know I'm going to end up with like an 8-9 wide receiver team, like a heavier in terms of quantity, that's too where I might break the ties earlier in favor of the uncertain players, the upside guys, because I know I'm going to be able to backfill some of that immediate production, that projectable volume that's not, that is in some situations overvalued by the market, but based on exactly how I'm constructing my team, it's undervalued and it fits in my team really well. So considering how many players you're going to end up taking at the position based on how you start in the draft is important too.
The part that you mentioned there with the running backs from last season, I think it's a very valid point. Like we've in the past, players changing teams generally hasn't had like that sort of hit rate. And I've like at the start of the offseason, a lot of people that I had on the show, we were talking about things that people may, buy into from last year that maybe, in 2 years' time we're like, well, we overreacted. Do you think there's a chance with how that veteran running back group did last year in particular that we kind of maybe lessen the emphasis on some of those moves at like the wide receiver position this year? Because we've seen a lot of wide receiver movement. I mentioned Diggs, Debo. Like then if we look at like Cup, but you look at the likes of a Brandon Ayuk who's coming back from his injury, there's just a lot of people like that this season, particularly in that range. Even a Jerry Jeudy, you mentioned like that we can project, but at the same time, like he had like a really quiet start to the season. He smashed it down the stretch, with the, like when we're looking at like a DK Metcalf in the 5th round over at the FFPC, or we're looking at Jerry Jeudy in the 7th round, like I don't think there's that much of a difference in like what those players are like. But if Jerry Jeudy gets any sort of quarterback play and becomes the wide receiver one and has not to the heights of last season, like I do think there's a way that he can vastly outperform that ADP, or a Chris Olave with his injuries, for example, and his issues last year, and then the quarterback discount this year. If like there's any sort of viable play, I think there's some of those names that are in that vein that can still change the trajectory of these teams. Looking at that range of the draft, I do think there's going to be a couple of players that come out of that really change how we feel in, the next 4 months about how they should have been ranked heading into the season. With the changes and the likes of, Diggs is moving, but New England's kind of quarterback and everything's in place. The likes of a Cup who's moving now with a Sam Darnold with a new kind of coaching environment and a huge amount of changes. Is that something that you think is baked into the risk of the ADPs? And is that something that bothers you once you, and we're going to talk about this in the second show later this week, but you and Ben Gretsch have done your projection series or are working your way through it and you're looking at some of these offenses. Once you do the complete kind of holistic view of the offense, the players, trajectory, and so on, I'm sure you're pretty comfortable with it when you get to that point. But how should people who are not going through the full projection process feel about players like this one trying to decipher their upside?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I can sit here saying like I want to invest in these players in uncertain situations and moving parts, but there's still a micro analysis to be done. So someone like Cooper Kupp's a good example of a player that I'm not really that in on, despite him kind of fitting that uncertainty profile. I'm a little bit more concerned with kind of the skill decline we have seen, the age, and like a downgrade in quarterback play and environment, going from Matthew Stafford, who just historically has just been awesome for wide receiver fantasy and just a really talented quarterback, to Sam Darnold, a quarterback that I think was really propped up by the environment around him last year, between the coaching, the skill players, and all of that. So I'm worried about Cooper Kupp. So I won't blindly be in on all these guys. I'd say more times than not. One that I don't think we mentioned too, that's really interesting to me, is George Pickens going to Dallas, where I just feel like it's like the absolute perfect fit. Gretchen and I talked about this on the offseason projection special on Establish the Edge. How that translates to his fantasy upside is to be determined, because obviously CeeDee Lamb is going to run every route and have a massive target share. There's not much behind him, and we haven't seen Pickens with the quality of quarterback play he's going to have with a team that goes at a pretty fast pace and is willing to throw the ball. Plays in a dome half the year, at least half the year. So I'm excited about that.
It's kind of the opposite of everything he's ever dealt with in his career, especially.
Yeah, and all those potential uncertainties like play more into his favor than against.
Yeah.
The only thing that doesn't play into his favor is he's not the number one on his team like he was last year. But I think that's where the market tends to kind of fixate on a little bit more, is that component of it, the volume component, when we look at these uncertain situations. And as a result, Pickens is cheaper than he was last year, when, arguably he should be more expensive, because he can still carve out, a target share around 20% and just be way, way more efficient and consistent in that type of offense due to the changes in play calling, changing in quarterback play, having the help with CeeDee Lamb there. So
better matchups,
Whereas, going back to the Kupp thing, it's like downgrade in quarterback, downgrade in home stadium, continues, going the wrong way in the age direction, has had some health concerns. And I try not to overrate like health risk, because a lot of that's just chasing what's happened recently. But when you combine it with the age and some of the on-field production, it does worry me.
And when we get back into the conversation again about the hits versus misses, a player that he did mention in that question was Breece Hall. And when we look through some of the running backs that are kind of going in that range, there's a couple of them in there. There's a couple of wide receivers that kind of feel that way. You mentioned the age cliff, with Cooper Kupp, but there's a few of these veterans also that could be approaching, potential age cliffs. I mentioned the likes of an Adams, but even like a Terry McLaurin, who had a very strong year last year, Mike Evans, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, they're all kind of getting up there. Is there any of those that are kind of striking out where you're thinking the floor could completely fall out of these? But my opening question was going to be with the Breece Hall part. Like, he is priced, it feels like, at a floor, but we've seen this in the past where running backs are like not hitting the heights that maybe we hope for as they enter the NFL and as that progresses. And then it just continues to be this thing where like next year he's going to be in the 8th round, the following year he's going to be in the teens. He feels
the
like
Kyle Pitts trajectory.
Yeah, to bring a name up. I was thinking in my head of Zeke Elliott, who was somebody who and I don't want to compare the two players, but it clinged on for multiple years as he kind of slid down through the ADP as well. But he feels like a player, if he's healthy and things go in the right direction for him, that like he could have a massive season. But how are those names? Are you feeling about the risk with some of those guys? Is there anything that you like to take the risk on? And, is there anything you're really in on?
So Breece is the type of player that I've just kind of a sucker for. The player that, really strong prospect, then did it at the NFL level the way we expected to see, and then
got hurt.
due to a combination of health and circumstance, had a pretty down year and now is much cheaper. I've gotten in trouble with these types of players in the past. Juju Smith-Schuster, Kyle Pitts are the two that like stick out in my mind the most, where I kind of chase those guys with, varying degrees of success, more failure than success. But yeah, I look at the range he's going in, and there are some vets that I'm worried about. Kyron Williams goes half a round earlier than him, and the pass catching floor isn't great for him. They've drafted a running back each of the past 2 off seasons. So that's someone that, even though he's shown a ceiling in the past, he's really contingent upon his offense performing really well and him continuing to get all of those touches in the red zone, because he gets a lot of low value touches in there as well, with the lack of target. So that's the type of player that I'm a little bit concerned about and would prefer, Breece Hall, especially at a cheaper cost in that range.
He's somebody that I'm like you. I'm finding it like I'm having to fight clicking the button to take him in drafts. But I also have like that thing in the back of my mind of like, maybe we are just going to phase out of like an NFL career that never truly happened to the way that we expected it to happen. But I think at like RB 13, 14, that kind of range, the upside is just massive. But he's just right there at the kind of end of that wide receiver cliff. Like, although like we talked about Hill there, if Hill was gone, you start to come into that conversation. But yeah, the wide receivers then that I touched on, how are you feeling, particularly the veterans that are like, they're going in kind of round 3, 4 across both sites, FFPC and Underdog. But I feel like more so than like big hit, big miss players at this area, it's the big miss where like the floor just falls out of your 4th round pick or your 3rd round pick that I think can put just a huge hole in your team. We talked a little bit about the rookies. People might think like you're drafting a rookie in the first 5 rounds. That's very risky, but I think there's much more risk in a season-long bet of drafting some of these veterans where the floor just like completely comes out and it's the end of the line here.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on site and scoring system, because like the ADP and the scoring system matter so much. But I look at like Mike Evans, who on Underdog, I think the market is undervaluing him. Like he's built for, half PPR scoring with all the touchdown upside, and it is kind of a site that will really ding the veterans a bit more. But if you look at FFPC, it's sort of the opposite, right? Like we've got full PPR scoring. It's a site that is generally maybe a bit more in on the veterans and a bit more concerned over the rookies. And he's someone that is a little concerning in that range. There's also a couple of players that, historically, I would like this archetype of player in terms of talent, but you look at Garrett Wilson, who goes in that 3rd round. I am a little concerned. This is a small hit, big miss type of thing. Maybe not even big miss, but like small hit, small miss, with how the play calling might look with Justin Fields at quarterback. I know everybody's got that DJ Moore season in their head where he just went absolutely ham, but something Gretchen and I have talked about a lot, like he really ran so pure that season. I think you start figuring out the volume and it's a little bit hard to get there. Terry McLaurin's another player where he's never just been a really high target share guy for where he's going.
Running pure with the DJ Moore season. There's quite a few plays last year for Terry McLaurin that, the DJ Moore one, it's like, how many of these are repeatable? Like, there's contested catches where like the defender falls down after it and he's like walking to the end zone. We've seen, like, I keep coming back to the Terry McLaurin touchdown against the Cowboys last season where it's like, that's never happening again, where he takes it though. So like, I feel he's a player who I was very happy to see him have a good season last year, but I feel like some of the repeatable nature of those plays is very unlikely.
Yeah, and that's, those are the types of guys I'm a little bit concerned about. I think in that range, I prefer some of the players who are like in the peak of their career or a little bit younger, but then also have the play calling around them that could really allow them to ascend. You look at DJ Moore, honestly, going back to him, now that he's in a different offense than he was in, we can see a lot more efficiency from this offense than we have in the past. We could see a lot of volume go his way. I assume the skill player route participation is going to be really concentrated for Chicago. And there's just some uncertainty there with like a new head coach who was an awesome offensive coordinator, a year two quarterback who was the clear number one pick the year prior. Like that's someone I'm interested in. Xavier Worthy is someone I'm interested in that range as well, where people are pretty concerned about Rashee Rice being there, but I think that KC in general is just a buy low team in the passing game, where Mahomes had a couple down years. If they really, we know they want to throw the ball. They're top 3 in pass rate of expectation year in and year out. They have one of the best quarterbacks of all time. They have kind of an aging tight end and Travis Kelce who's falling off. Like there's room for 2 wide receivers to hit in a decent way. And he, unlike, and talk about the opposite of running pure, he had so many deep shots, at least in the regular season last year, that him and Mahomes just missed on.
Yeah.
And if he hits on even 2 of those, I think his cost is a lot more expensive than it is right now.
I agree. And I think that part of with some of these players, like it's like Worthy, for example, I think people are like either have decided one way or the other. Like we're kind of deciding that if those plays happen, like he's in a much different value. Everyone or said the other side is saying they didn't happen because he's not good enough. So it's quite an interesting year, I think, to place your bets on players. Like you mentioned DJ Moore, Roma Dunze last year, quite a few of those plays too, where like if Williams could hit some wide open receivers, we may have touchdowns to go along with that as well. We are going to close out there on the conversation for this one. We're going to look through some of the kind of projection based analysis on the show later this week. But Mike, as we close out, the listeners can check you out, obviously, if they're not already, on social media at 2hats1mike, and they can check out all the work over at Establish the Run. But I did hint at the series with Ben. Is there any other stuff coming out in the short period coming up that you'd like to highlight for them?
Mostly just, at Establish a Run, we continue to update our ranks every day throughout the offseason, stay on top of it. So whatever format you're playing, just make sure to check those out.
Okay, so we will be back with another edition in the later in the week, but make sure you subscribe. You'll get those once they are available. You can check them out on the RotoViz YouTube channel. You can check them out on the Fantasy Football podcast feed. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.